They say that silence is golden, but as I stood on the sidewalk in Ladera Heights, Los Angeles, the silence felt more like lead-heavy, cold, and sinking straight into my gut. My name is Malachi Hayes. I'm 72 years old, and for 48 of those years I shared a life with a woman who was smarter than I ever deserved. Serena was the kind of woman who could see a storm coming when the sky was still a perfect, mocking blue. She used to tell me, "Mac, you build buildings with foundations deep enough to withstand an earthquake, but you build your heart out of glass when it comes to that boy." She was talking about Jordan, our only son. And as I stood there in the fading California twilight, looking at the dark windows of the house I'd bought for him, I realized the glass was finally starting to shatter. The flight from Atlanta had been 5 hours of quiet reflection. I'd spent most of it looking at a photo of Serena from our last anniversary, her eyes bright, her smile knowing. Since the cancer took her a year ago, the house in Atlanta had become a mausoleum of memories. So, when Jordan and Megan started calling, their voices thick with a sudden, urgent concern, I allowed myself to believe it was genuine. "Dad, you're rattling around in that Biwami house," Jordan had said. "Come to LA, let us take care of you. We've missed you." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Grief has a way of making a smart man very, very stupid. I pulled my small carry-on suitcase behind me, the wheels clicking rhythmically against the pavers of the walkway. It was a beautiful home, a Spanish-style villa with a terracotta roof and lush, manicured palms. I had paid cash for it 10 years ago as a wedding gift, though technically, I'd put it in a trust. I told them it was a foundation, a way for them to build a life without the crushing weight of a Los Angeles mortgage. All I asked was that they keep it up and pay the utilities. But as I reached the porch, the first crack in the facade appeared. The lawn was patchy, the grass yellowing at the edges. One of the large decorative planters near the door was cracked, the dry soil spilling out like an open wound. The porch light was off, and the house felt hollowed out, as if the life had been sucked right out of it. I reached for the doorbell, but my hand stopped halfway. My eyes dropped to the mail slot. It wasn't just full, it was hemorrhaging. A thick stack of envelopes was jammed into the metal flap, half hanging out, while dozens more lay scattered on the welcome mat. I nudged a few with the toe of my shoe. Most were junk, but then I saw the color that every homeowner dreads: red. I leaned down, my old joints protesting, and picked up a windowed envelope. The bold, black letters on the red background screamed, "Final notice, disconnection imminent." I picked up another, "Past due, immediate action required." These weren't just utility bills. These were warnings from debt collection agencies and high-interest lenders. A coldness that had nothing to do with the evening breeze settled over me. I remembered Serena's voice, sharp and clear as if she were standing right behind me. "Mac, look at that girl's eyes. Megan isn't looking at Jordan. She's looking past him. She's looking at what he represents." I had dismissed it back then as a mother-in-law's protective instinct. I wanted Jordan to be happy. I wanted to think he'd found a partner who would build a legacy with him. But standing there, looking at a pile of financial wreckage, I knew I'd been a fool. I hadn't even been in the city for 20 minutes, and already the care they'd promised me was starting to smell like a trap. I rang the bell. The sound echoed through the house, deep and lonely. No one answered. I tried Jordan's cell phone. Voicemail. I tried Megan's. Voicemail. They knew I was coming. My flight had landed on time. I'd texted them from the taxi. They were supposed to be here, waiting with open arms and a home-cooked meal. Instead, I was standing on a dark porch in a city I didn't know, surrounded by their mounting failures. "Don't bother. They ain't home. Haven't seen that car in hours." The voice was gravelly and deep. I turned to see a man standing on the sidewalk of the house next door. He was about my age, maybe a few years younger, with a lean, upright posture that suggested a lifetime of discipline. He was African American, wearing a clean white t-shirt and holding a garden hose, though he wasn't watering anything. He was just watching me with eyes that were far too sharp for a casual neighbor. "I'm Malachi Hayes," I said, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "I'm Jordan's father." The man turned off the hose and walked toward the edge of his lawn. He didn't smile. "I know who you are, Mr. Hayes. I'm Alvin Henderson." He wiped his hand on a rag and looked at me with a strange expression, part pity, part warning. "You look just like the woman in the pictures." My heart skipped. "You knew Serena?" Alvin nodded slowly. "Not well, but she called me about 6 months before she passed. My wife, Clara, and Serena were at Spelman together decades ago. Serena tracked me down. She asked me to keep an eye on this place. On your son, and especially on her." He tilted his head toward the dark house. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. "Look, Mr. Hayes, I don't like to stick my nose in other people's business, but I made a promise to a dying woman. You need to get back in that cab, go to a hotel, or better yet, go back to the airport and get on the next flight to Atlanta." I gripped the handle of my suitcase. "What are you talking about? My son is in there." "Your son is a ghost," Alvin said, and there was a hardness in his eyes that made my blood run cold. "But that wife of his? She's a predator, and they're in deep, Mr. Hayes. Deep enough that people have been coming around this house at 3 in the morning. People who don't look like they're here to deliver the mail." I looked at the red envelopes on the porch. "Loan sharks? The kind that don't use banks," Alvin confirmed. "I've been a detective in this city for 30 years, and I know the smell of desperation. They've been talking, Mr. Hayes, bragging. I hear them in the backyard sometimes when they think I'm inside. Megan. She's been telling everyone that the big ATM was finally coming to town, that the old man from Atlanta was going to solve all their problems." The words hit me like a physical blow. The ATM. That's what I was to them. Not a father, not a grieving widower looking for comfort, but a payout. A resource to be liquidated. "They think you're simple," Alvin continued, his voice heavy with sympathy. "They think you're just some retired architect with a nice pension and a broken heart. They think you're an easy mark." I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the street pressing in on me. I thought about the buildings I'd designed in Atlanta, skyscrapers that stood against hurricane-force winds, hospitals that saved lives, structures built on foundations so deep they could never be moved. I had spent my life creating things that lasted, and yet I had failed to build a son who had an ounce of integrity. I looked at Alvin. "They think I'm a sheep coming to the slaughter," I said, my voice steadying. "They've forgotten who I am. They've forgotten that you don't get to build a skyline by being weak." Alvin looked at me, and for the first time, a small, grim smile touched his lips. "I told Serena you were a good man. She told me you were a dangerous one if someone touched your family. I think I see what she meant now." "Thank you, Alvin," I said, "for the warning, and for the promise you kept." "What are you going to do?" he asked. I looked back at the dark, empty house. The final notice was still gripped in my hand. "I'm going to wait," I said. "They invited me here to take care of me. It would be rude not to let them try." I didn't go to a hotel. I walked around the side of the house. I knew where the spare key was. Serena and I had hidden it under a loose stone in the garden a decade ago, just in case of an emergency. My fingers brushed the cold, damp earth as I moved the stone. The key was there, tucked away, and forgotten by the 2 people who lived inside. I let myself in through the back door. The house was even colder inside than it was out. It smelled of stale air and expensive, unwashed laundry. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness of the kitchen, my suitcase at my feet, and I waited. I listened to the house, the hum of a refrigerator that probably hadn't been filled in weeks, the creak of the floorboards. An hour passed, then 2. I thought about the accounts I had in Atlanta, the portfolios, the real estate holdings, the legacy Serena and I had spent 48 years building. Jordan and Megan thought they were playing a game of checkers with a confused old man. They didn't realize I had already mastered the board. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of a car engine. Headlights swept across the kitchen wall, bright and intrusive. A heavy door slammed, then another. "I'm telling you, Jordan, if he's not here, we're screwed." A woman's voice, sharp and frantic, cut through the night. "Vinny isn't going to wait another week," he was clear. "He said he was coming, Megan. His flight landed 2 hours ago. Maybe he went to a hotel?" Jordan's voice sounded thin, reeking of a weakness that made my stomach turn. "A hotel? With what money?" "He's a cheap old man, Jordan. He's probably sitting on the porch like a lost dog." I heard the front door lock turn. The lights in the hallway flared to life, blinding me for a second. They walked in, laughing nervously, Megan adjusting her expensive hair, Jordan looking at his phone. They didn't see me at first. They were too busy calculating their next move. "Well," I said, my voice cutting through their chatter like a cold blade, "I was wondering when you'd get home." They both froze. Megan let out a small, sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Jordan looked like he'd seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. He'd seen the man he thought he could manipulate, and he hadn't realized that the ATM was about to start charging a very high rate of interest. The silence that followed my greeting was thick enough to choke on. Jordan actually tripped over his own feet, stumbling against the doorframe, while Megan's hand stayed frozen at her collarbone, her eyes darting around the darkened kitchen like a trapped bird. For a heartbeat, the air was filled with the smell of their fear, a sharp metallic scent that told me everything I needed to know before a single word was even spoken. "Dad?" Jordan finally choked out, his voice cracking like a teenager's. He fumbled for the light switch, and the sudden fluorescent glare was unforgiving. It highlighted the sweat on his forehead and the frantic, hollow look in his eyes. You scared the life out of us. We thought someone had broken in." "I have a key, Jordan," I said calmly, staying seated in the shadows of the breakfast nook. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just watched them. I've had it for 10 years. I assume that's still okay, considering I'm the one who pays the property taxes. Megan recovered faster. She always did. That was the first thing Serena had noticed about her, the way she could pivot from panic to poise in the blink of an eye. She smoothed her hair, a practiced, graceful movement, and forced a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Of course, Mac. We were just so worried when we didn't see you out front. We had to run out a last-minute emergency at the office. You know how the marketing world is. It never sleeps." It was the first lie of the night. I knew from Alvin that she hadn't had an office to go to in 6 months. I knew she'd been fired for dipping her fingers into the company till. But I played along. I wanted to see how far they'd go. I wanted to see the shape of the hole they were digging for themselves. "Emergencies happen," I said, standing up slowly. I made sure to let out a small, weary sigh, playing the part of the tired, aging father. "I'm just glad to be out of the heat." Atlanta was humid, but LA feels heavy. Jordan rushed forward then, grabbing my suitcase with an overeagerness that felt pathetic. "Let me get that for you, Dad. You must be exhausted. We've got the guest room all set up. Well, mostly. We're in the middle of a few upgrades." As he led me through the house, I didn't see upgrades. I saw the slow, agonizing death of a home. This house was a Spanish masterpiece when I bought it. All clean lines and sturdy bones. Now, the plaster was cracked in the corners. There was a water stain on the ceiling in the hallway that looked months old. But, as we passed the living room, I saw where the money had gone. A massive 80-inch television occupied an entire wall. A designer leather sofa, probably costing more than a mid-sized sedan, sat on a rug that was stained and frayed. They were living in a shell. They were decorating a sinking ship with gold leaf, hoping no one would notice the water rising in the hold. "Hungry?" Megan asked, her voice high and artificial as she followed us. "I can whip something up, or we could order in. There's this amazing sushi place nearby that everyone is talking about." "Sushi sounds expensive," I remarked, watching her reaction closely. "Oh, treat yourself, Mac. You're on vacation," she chirped. "Besides, we have so much to celebrate." "Jordan's been doing incredibly well. Haven't you, honey?" Jordan mumbled something about a big contract and disappeared up the stairs with my bag. I stayed in the hallway, my eyes landing on a side table where a pile of mail had been hastily shoved under a decorative bowl. A corner of a red envelope peeked out. I looked at Megan. She was watching me, her head tilted slightly, like a predator trying to decide if the prey had noticed the trap. She was wearing a dress that cost at least $1,000, and her watch was a Rolex that Jordan's salary shouldn't have been able to touch in a decade. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They were drowning in debt, yet they were dressed for a gala. "Is everything okay, Mac?" she asked, her voice softening into that loving daughter-in-law tone that made my skin crawl. "You look distant. I know it's been hard since Serena passed. We really want this trip to be about healing, for all of us." "Healing," I repeated. "That's a nice word, Megan. Serena always said the best way to heal a wound was to clean it out first. Make sure there's no rot left inside." Her smile flickered, just for a millisecond. A flash of something dark and sharp crossed her face before the mask snapped back into place. She was a wise woman. "Come, sit. Let's get you some water." "You look a little pale." She led me into the living room, and I sat on that expensive leather sofa. It was uncomfortable, too firm, too cold, much like the woman sitting across from me. Jordan joined us a moment later, his hands shaking slightly as he sat on the edge of an armchair. He couldn't look me in the eye. He kept checking his phone, his thumbs blurring across the screen. "So," I started, leaning back. "Tell me about this big opportunity you mentioned on the phone, Jordan. You sounded very excited." Jordan flinched. He looked at Megan, waiting for the cue. She gave him a small, imperceptible nod. "Right. The opportunity," Jordan said, clearing his throat. It's a real estate play, Dad. Commercial. There's this strip mall in Culver City. The owners are in a pinch, and they're looking for a quick cash buyout. If we move fast, We can flip it in 6 months and triple our investment. It's a sure thing. There is no such thing as a sure thing in real estate. I'd been an architect for 40 years. I'd seen sure things turn into dust and lawsuits more times than I could count. Triple? I asked, widening my eyes in mock surprise. My goodness, that's a lot of money. How much do you need to get in? We've already put in most of it. Megan jumped in, her voice hushed and conspiratorial. We've liquidated everything, Mac. We're that confident. But we're about 50,000 short for the final escrow deposit. The deadline is Friday. 50,000, I mused. I looked around the room at the peeling paint and the water-stained ceiling. And you've put in all your savings? Every penny, Jordan lied. I could see the pulse thrumming in his neck. He was a terrible liar. I had raised him better than this, or so I thought. But maybe I hadn't. Maybe by giving him everything, I'd taught him that the truth was optional as long as the check cleared. We were thinking, Megan said, leaning forward and placing a hand on my knee. Her touch was like ice. Since you're family, and since this is such a guaranteed win, we wanted to give you the chance to come in on it. Not as a loan, but as a partner. You deserve to have a little extra cushion in your retirement, Dad. We want to take care of you. They wanted to take care of me, all right. They wanted to take care of my bank account until there was nothing left but the decimal points. I appreciate that, Megan. Truly, I said. I let a bit of emotion creep into my voice, playing the role of the grateful, lonely father. It's been a long year. My pension, well, it's stable, but it doesn't leave much for sure things. I'd have to move some things around. Talk to my people back in Atlanta. The relief that washed over their faces was almost comical. They thought they had me. They thought the big ATM was about to spit out the cash they needed to keep the loan sharks at bay. Take your time, of course, Megan said, though her eyes said, hurry up. But like Jordan said, the window is closing. We just want to make sure we don't lose out on this for the sake of a few days. I'll sleep on it, I said, standing up. The flight has caught up with me. I think I'll turn in. Jordan practically escorted me to the guest room. It was a small room, tucked away at the back of the house. The bed was unmade, and there was a layer of dust on the nightstand. They hadn't expected me to stay. They'd expected me to write a check and disappear back to Atlanta. I waited until I heard their footsteps retreat down the hall. I waited until the muffled sounds of their voices started up again in the master bedroom, sharp, angry whispers that cut through the thin walls. I moved to the window. Across the narrow driveway, I could see Alvin Henderson's house. A single light was on in his living room. He was still awake. He was still watching. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked my messages. Nothing from my lawyer yet. I looked at the contact list and scrolled down to a name I hadn't called in years. A man I'd done business with back when I was still building the skyline of Atlanta. A man who knew exactly how to track down business associates like Vinny. I was about to dial when I heard a sound from the hallway. A soft, wet thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. Then, a low, guttural moan that didn't sound like Jordan or Megan. I froze, my hand hovering over the screen. The sound came again, followed by the unmistakable click of the front door being forced open. Not with a key, but with a crowbar. The loan sharks weren't waiting for Friday. I moved to the door of the guest room and cracked it open just an inch. The hallway was dark, but I could hear breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing. And then, Megan's voice, a terrified whimper that sounded nothing like the woman who had just tried to con me. Please, she whispered. He's here. He has the money. Just give us until tomorrow. Tomorrow was yesterday, Megan. The voice was cold, flat, and echoed with a casual violence that made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't know who Vinny was yet, but I knew his work. I retreated back into the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wasn't just a father visiting his son anymore. I was a witness to a crime that had been years in the making, but as I looked at the door, I realized something. If they were desperate enough to bring men like this into the house while I was sleeping, they weren't just looking for a loan. They were looking for a way to make sure I never left. I reached into my bag and pulled out the one thing I never traveled without. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a black leather folder containing the original trust documents for the house. Documents that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Jordan and Megan didn't own a single brick of the roof over their heads. What happened next would determine if I was going to be a victim, or if I was going to be the man who burned their world to the ground. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the guest room door, my breath hitching in my throat. The house, which had felt like a hollow shell only moments ago, was now vibrating with a predatory energy. In the darkness of that small room, the smells of dust and neglect seemed to sharpen, grounding me in a reality I had tried to ignore for far too long. I wasn't just a grieving widower anymore. I was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, watching my own son prepare to push me off. "I told you, he's asleep." Megan's voice came again, a jagged, frantic whisper that carried through the hallway. "If you wake him up now, he'll get spooked. He's old, he's fragile. If he calls the police, nobody gets paid." "I don't give a damn about his sleep, Megan," the intruder growled. His voice was like grinding stones, heavy with the weight of someone who did this for a living. This wasn't a business associate in a suit. This was the muscle. Vinny's patience ended at midnight. 50,000 was the interest on the interest. The principal is still sitting at 200. You told us the ATM was arriving tonight. Well, the bank is open, and I'm here to make a withdrawal. 200,000. The number sat in the air like a poisonous fog. My son and his wife weren't just in a pinch. They were buried. They had lied about the amount. They had lied about the investment. And now they were bartering with my life, as if I were nothing more than a stack of bearer bonds. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest, a phantom echo of the heartbreak Serena must have felt when she realized what our son was becoming. I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate boots moving toward the living room. I stayed frozen, my hand still gripping the black leather folder containing the trust documents. I knew I had to act, but I also knew that a man of 72 doesn't win a physical fight against a wolf. I had to use the only weapons I had left. My mind and the silence they assumed was my weakness. "Jordan, say something," Megan hissed. I can talk to him in the morning." Jordan's voice was barely a whimper. It was the sound of the boy who used to hide behind my legs when a neighbor's dog barked too loud. But he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a 40-year-old man letting a stranger threaten his father in his own home. He's got the money. I know he does. He's been living like a monk in Atlanta for years. He's got the firm's buyout money, the life insurance from Mom. It's all just sitting there. "Then get it," the intruder said. I heard the sound of a heavy chair being dragged across the hardwood floor. "I'll wait. But if I'm still sitting here when the sun comes up, I'm going into that back room, and I'm going to start taking fingers until the checkbook comes out. Do you understand me?" I retreated from the door, moving with a silent grace I hadn't used since my days climbing scaffolding on construction sites. I needed to get to my phone, but more importantly, I needed to get to the truth. I slipped the leather folder under the mattress, then moved to the window. Across the way, Alvin's light was still on. He was the only ally I had in this zip code, but I couldn't risk a call yet. If they heard me talking, the fragile old man act would be over, and the violence would begin. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. I began to piece together the fragments of the last year, the constant nagging phone calls from Megan, the way Jordan would get quiet when I asked about his job. They hadn't wanted me to visit because they missed me. They had been scouting me. They had been waiting for the grief to soften my brain enough that I wouldn't question a triple-your-money investment. I realized then that the red envelopes on the porch were just the tip of the iceberg. They hadn't just failed to pay the light bill. They had gambled away the very roof over their heads. And the most sickening part? They didn't even own it. They were trying to sell my house to pay off a debt to a man who broke fingers for breakfast. I heard the heavy boots move away from the hallway and back toward the kitchen. A fridge door opened, the clink of glass against glass. They were making themselves at home. I knew I couldn't stay in that room forever. I had to see the face of the man who thought he owned me. I waited 10 minutes, counting every second by the frantic beat of my heart. Then, I slowly opened the guest room door. I didn't wear my shoes. My socks muffled my steps on the hardwood. I crept down the hall, the darkness, my only shroud. As I reached the corner of the living room, I saw them. Megan was pacing by the window, her face a mask of sweating terror. Jordan was slumped on the designer sofa, his head in his hands. And sitting at the dining room table, illuminated by a single lamp, was a man who looked like he was carved out of shadows. He was thick-necked, wearing a dark canvas jacket, and he was casually peeling an orange with a pocket knife that looked far too sharp. "He's got a Rolex," Megan whispered, leaning over the table toward the man. "The one Serena gave him for their 40th anniversary. It's worth 20,000 easy. Take that as a down payment. Just leave him alone tonight." My heart stopped. That watch was the last thing Serena had ever bought for me. It was inscribed on the back, "To my foundation, forever yours, S." It was more than gold and gears. It was the heartbeat of my marriage. and Megan was offering it up like a piece of scrap metal. "I don't want a watch, lady," the man said, not even looking up from his orange. "I want the wire transfer," Vinny said. "No more toys. No more promises. If the old man doesn't sign the papers for the investment by 10 a.m., things get messy." Investment. They were going to use a fake business contract to funnel my money directly into Vinny's pockets. It was a clean, legal-looking way to rob me blind. And if I didn't sign, the threat was clear. "He'll sign," Jordan whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll tell him it's for my future. He'll do anything for me." "He'd better," the man said, finally looking up. His eyes were dead, devoid of any human heat. "Because if he doesn't, I'm not just taking the watch, I'm taking the arm it's attached to." I backed away, my stomach churning. The betrayal was complete. My son wasn't just a victim of bad luck. He was an accomplice. He was willing to watch me be maimed, to watch his mother's most precious gift be stolen, all to cover the tracks of his own cowardice. I made it back to the guest room and closed the door with a click that sounded like a gunshot in my ears. I sat in the dark, the weight of the Rolex on my wrist feeling heavier than lead. I looked at the light in Alvin's window across the street. He was still there. He was my witness. But I realized I didn't just want to escape. I didn't want to just call the police and have a messy scene that would lead to a slap on the wrist for my son. No, Serena had warned me that I was a blind father. Well, the scales had fallen from my eyes. I saw the rot now. I saw the debt, the greed, and the cold-blooded willingness to sacrifice the man who had given them everything. I pulled out my phone and dialed Cynthia Pham, my lawyer in Atlanta. It was 3 a.m. there, but Cynthia didn't sleep. She waited for the world to catch up to her. "Mac?" Her voice was sharp, immediate. "Why are you calling me at this hour? Is everything okay in L.A.? "Cynthia," I whispered, my voice cold and hard as granite. "I need you to pull the files on the Ladera Heights Trust. And I need you to find me a private investigator in Los Angeles who doesn't mind working in the dark." "Mac, what's going to happen?" "I'm about to give my son exactly what he asked for," I said, staring at the door. "I'm going to give him a lesson in what happens when you try to liquidate a man who spent his life building foundations." I hung up before she could ask another question. I knew what I had to do. I had to play the part. I had to be the big ATM. I had to let them think they were winning. Because the only way to catch a wolf is to let him think the sheep is already dead. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Megan's forced, cheerful humming. I walked into the kitchen, making sure to limp a little more than usual, my hand trembling as I reached for a mug. "Morning, Dad," Jordan said, his face a grotesque mask of forced normalcy. He was wearing a fresh shirt, but his eyes were bloodshot. "Sleep okay?" "A little restless," I said, looking him straight in the eye. I thought I heard noises in the night, like the front door. Megan froze with a spatula in her hand. "Oh, that was just the wind, Mac. These old houses, they creak so much. You just aren't used to the California coast." "I suppose," I said, sitting down. I looked at the empty space on the dining room table where the man had been sitting just hours ago. He was gone, but the scent of his canvas jacket and that sharp orange peel still lingered in the air. "So," Jordan said, leaning in, his voice hushed. "About that investment? The 50,000? I was thinking, maybe we should just get the paperwork out of the way this morning. The window is closing fast." I looked at him, my only son, and I felt a cold, dark resolve settle into my bones. "You know, Jordan, I was thinking the same thing, but why stop at 50,000? If this is a sure thing, maybe I should put in more. Maybe I should put in everything." The look of pure, naked greed that flashed across Megan's face was the last nail in the coffin. She didn't even try to hide it. "Everything?" she breathed. "Everything," I said. "But I have one condition. I want to meet the people I'm doing business with. I want to meet this Vinny you mentioned." The color drained from Jordan's face so fast I thought he might faint. "Vinny? No, Dad, he's just a silent partner. He doesn't like meetings." "Well," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee, "I don't like writing 6-figure checks to ghosts. You want the money, Jordan? You bring the wolf to the table." I didn't know it yet, but that invitation was the beginning of the end. What I didn't tell them was that I wasn't coming to the meeting alone. I was bringing 40 years of architectural precision and a legal team that would make Vinny look like a schoolyard bully. But as I sat there, watching them whisper in the corner, I felt a vibration in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. "I see you, Mr. Hayes. Don't go to the meeting. They aren't just looking for money anymore." I looked out the window at Alvin's house. He wasn't in his garden. He wasn't in his window, but the front door of his house was standing wide open. I stared at that text message until the words blurred into a jagged neon smear against the screen. I see you, Mr. Hayes. Don't go to the meeting. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but my pulse was a frantic drum in my ears. I looked back out at Alvin's house across the driveway. The morning sun was hitting the white stucco, making it look bright and innocent, but that open front door was a dark, yawning mouth. Alvin Henderson was a man of ritual. He didn't leave his door open to the street unless the world had stopped turning. "Dad, you okay? You've been staring at that coffee for 5 minutes." Jordan's voice pulled me back, but it didn't feel like a lifeline. It felt like a tether. I slipped the phone into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold gold of Serena's Rolex. I had to stay in character. I had to be the sheep. "Just thinking about the numbers, Jordan," I said, forcedly smoothing my features into a mask of weary confusion. "It's a lot of money. I'm just trying to figure out which accounts to liquidate first. You know how the taxes are on these things." The word liquidate acted like a shot of adrenaline to Megan. She was at my side in a heartbeat, her hand cold as a morgue slab resting on my shoulder. "We have a wonderful accountant who can help with all of that, Mac. We just need to get the paperwork started. If we meet with Vinny's people at 2, we can have the preliminary signatures done by dinner." 2 o'clock, I repeated. "And where are we meeting?" "A quiet place," Megan said, her voice dropping into that soothing, manipulative purr. "A private office in Century City. Very professional. You'll feel right at home." Professional. That was a laugh. These people wouldn't know professional if it hit them with a subpoena. I stood up, feigning a sudden dizzy spell, grabbing the edge of the table. "I need some air. I think I'll take a walk around the block. Clear my head before we dive into all this legal talk. Maybe I should come with you?" Jordan started to rise, his face a map of anxiety. "No," I snapped. A bit sharper than I intended, I softened my tone quickly. "No, son. I just need 10 minutes of peace. The city it's a lot louder than Atlanta. Stay here, finish your breakfast." I walked out the front door, feeling their eyes boring into my back through the glass. The moment I hit the sidewalk, the California heat wrapped around me, but I felt a chill that went straight to the bone. I didn't walk around the block. I walked straight to Alvin's driveway. The silence at Alvin's was different from the silence at Jordan's. Jordan's house felt empty. Alvin's house felt hollowed. I stepped onto the porch, my eyes scanning the ground. There, near the welcome mat, was a single, crushed rose from his garden and a smear of dirt that looked like the tread of a heavy boot. The same boots I'd heard in the hallway last night. "Alvin?" I called out softly, pushing the door open further. The living room was exactly as I'd seen it through the window, immaculate, orderly, a testament to a man who lived with discipline. But on the coffee table, his phone was lying face down. Beside it was a small, hand-drawn map of the neighborhood with a circle around my son's house. I picked up the phone. It wasn't locked. The last message sent was to me. "I see you, Mr. Hayes. Don't go to the meeting." He hadn't sent it from safety. He'd sent it while they were in the house. I looked toward the kitchen and saw a shadow move. My heart nearly stopped, but it was just a curtain fluttering in the breeze from an open back window. Alvin was gone. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just the terrifying absence of a man who had promised to watch over me. They had neutralized my only ally, and they hadn't even had the decency to do it quietly. I realized then that the meeting at 2 o'clock wasn't just about a $50,000 loan. They were moving faster than I'd anticipated. I slipped Alvin's phone into my pocket and walked back to my son's house, my mind whirring with the cold, calculated precision of an architect. If the foundation is compromised, you don't try to patch the walls. You let the building fall, and you make sure you're the only one left standing when the dust clears. When I walked back into the kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted. The loving family mask hadn't just slipped, it had been discarded. Megan was standing by the counter, a glass of wine in her hand even though it wasn't even noon. Jordan was sitting at the table, a stack of papers in front of him. "Change of plans, Mac," Megan said. Her voice was flat now, stripped of the sugary coating. "We don't need to wait until 2. The partners are on their way here. They thought it would be more intimate." "Here?" I asked, my voice trembling. This time, I didn't have to fake it. "But I haven't even talked to my bank." "We took the liberty of looking through your bag, Dad," Jordan said. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the stack of papers as if they held the secrets to his salvation. "We saw the trust documents for this house, the ones you've been hiding. The black leather folder was sitting on the counter. They'd gone into my room, moved the mattress, and taken it. My own son had raided my room like a common thief while I was out looking for a missing neighbor. "That's private, Jordan," I said, my voice low. "That house was a gift to give you a start, not an asset for you to strip." "A gift?" Megan laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that made me want to slap her. "A gift with strings, Mac. You kept it in a trust. You kept the control. You've been hovering over us for 10 years, playing the benevolent king while we struggled to keep up appearances. Do you have any idea how much it costs to live in this neighborhood? To move in the circles we move in?" "Appearances don't pay the light bill, Megan," I said, "and they certainly don't pay off men like Vinny." The mention of his name made her flinch, but only for a second. She took a long sip of her wine and walked toward me, stopping just inches from my face. I could smell the expensive grapes and the cheap desperation on her breath. "You're going to sign the house over to the investment group, Mac, today. We've already had the papers drawn up, a power of attorney transfer. It's all legal, or legal enough. You sign, Vinny gets the deed, and our debt is wiped clean. You get to go back to Atlanta and live out your days in that dusty old house, and we get a fresh start. And if I don't?" Megan reached out and gripped my wrist, the one wearing Serena's Rolex. She twisted it, not enough to break it, but enough to let me feel the strength in her fingers. "Then things get very complicated, for everyone, including your friend Mr. Henderson. He's taking a nap right now. We'd hate for it to become permanent." The room went cold. They had him. They were using a 70-year-old man's life to leverage a house I'd bought with 40 years of hard labor. I looked at Jordan. "Are you really going to let her do this? This is your mother's friend. This is your father." Jordan looked up, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised. But then he looked at Megan, at the way she held herself, at the promise of a life without the crushing weight of his own failures, and his eyes went dead. "Just sign it, Dad," he whispered. "It's just a house. You have plenty of money. Why do you have to be so stubborn? Why do you have to make this so hard for us?" In that moment, the last thread of my fatherly hope snapped. It didn't break with a bang. It dissolved into a cold, black ash. My son wasn't a victim of Megan's manipulation. He was a willing participant in my destruction. He didn't want my love or my guidance. He wanted my liquidation. "Fine," I said, my voice as hollow as the house. "I'll sign, but I want to see Alvin first. I want to know he's safe." "You'll see him once the notary is finished," Megan said, her eyes gleaming with a predatory triumph. "He's in the garage. He's fine. Just a little tied up at the moment." She pushed the papers toward me. I looked at the top page. It wasn't just a power of attorney. It was a total transfer of assets. They weren't just taking the house. They were trying to take everything I owned in California and giving Vinny the right to pursue my holdings in Georgia. It was a death warrant for my financial life. I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was the tremors of a man holding back a tidal wave. I looked at the signature line. "You know," I said, pausing with the pen hovering over the paper, "Serena always said that a building is only as strong as its weakest point. I spent 40 years making sure my designs were flawless. I never thought the weakest point in my life would be my own blood." "Save the philosophy for the flight home, Mac," Megan snapped. "Sign the damn paper." I was about to touch the pen to the page when a loud, rhythmic thumping started coming from the front door. Not a knock, a heavy, authoritative pounding. "LAPD, open up!" Megan's face went white. Jordan surged to his feet, knocking his chair over. "I thought you said the neighbors wouldn't call," he hissed at her. "They didn't," she whispered back, her eyes darting to the window. The pounding came again. "We have a report of a missing person at this address. Open the door now, or we will breach." Megan grabbed the papers from the table, shoving them into her designer bag. She grabbed me by the arm, her nails digging into my skin. "You don't say a word, you hear me? You're confused. You're elderly. We're just taking care of you. If you mention Vinny, if you mention the garage, Alvin is dead before they get through the door. Do you understand?" I looked at her, and then at Jordan, who was trembling like a leaf in the wind. I didn't know yet who had called the police. I didn't know if Alvin was really okay. But as the front door splintered under the force of a battering ram, I realized that the meeting had just moved to a much larger stage. "I understand everything, Megan," I said, a slow, dark smile finally touching my lips. I didn't know it yet, but this was exactly what I'd been waiting for. As the officers swarmed into the hallway, guns drawn, Megan shoved me toward the sofa, her face instantly contorting into a mask of tearful, panicked concern. "Oh," "Thank God you're here," she wailed, her voice a perfect imitation of a terrified woman. "My father-in-law, he's having a breakdown. He's been threatening us. Please, you have to help him." I sat on the sofa, the fragile old man once more, and watched the chaos unfold. They thought they could use the law to cover their tracks. They thought they could turn the police against the victim. They had no idea that I had spent the last hour, while they were raiding my room, sending every single piece of evidence I'd gathered, the red envelopes, the audio of the threat, the trust documents, to a server they didn't even know existed. But then, as an officer moved to question me, I saw something that stopped my heart. In the commotion, Megan had slipped toward the back of the house, and she wasn't going for the garage. She was going for the gas line. The living room was a kaleidoscope of blue and red strobes, the frantic shouts of the LAPD officers creating a wall of noise that should have felt like safety. But as I sat on that cold leather sofa, watching an officer approach me with his hands up in a placating gesture, I didn't feel safe. I felt like I was watching a slow-motion car crash, and my own son was the one flooring the accelerator. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them," the officer said, his voice firm but laced with the kind of forced patience you use for a child or a madman. "He's confused, officer. Please be careful." Megan's voice rose to a hysterical pitch from the hallway. She was leaning against the wall, clutching her chest, a stray tear tracing a perfect path through her expensive foundation. "He hasn't been the same since my mother-in-law passed. He gets these episodes. He's been talking about people in the walls, about men coming to hurt us. We were just trying to get him to lie down." I looked at her, and for a second, I felt a twisted sense of admiration. She was a virtuoso of deceit. She had taken my very real fear for my life and repackaged it as a symptom of senility. She was weaponizing my grief, turning the memory of Serena into a tool to strip me of my agency. "Dad, just listen to them, okay?" Jordan was hovering behind the officer, his face a pale, sweating mask of guilt. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at the floor, at the wall, anywhere but at the man who had given him everything. "We just want you to get help. We want you to be safe." I realized then that they weren't just trying to rob me anymore. They were trying to erase me. If they could convince the police I was incompetent, the trust documents didn't matter. They could have me committed, take over the estate, and pay off Vinny with my own blood, while I sat in a padded room, wondering where it all went wrong. "Officer," I said, my voice steady, though I kept it thin, a little shaky. "I'm not confused. My name is Malachi Hayes. I live at 1422 Riverside Drive in Atlanta. I'm here visiting my son." "We know who you are, mister." "Hayes," the officer said, glancing back at Megan, who was now shaking her head with a look of profound, manufactured tragedy. "He memorized his address, but he doesn't know what year it is," she cried. "Check his bag, officer. He has all these legal documents he's been obsessing over, thinking people are trying to steal his house. It's a classic delusion." The officer signaled to his partner, who headed toward the guest room. My heart skipped. They were going for the bag. They were going for the trust documents they had already stolen and moved. Megan had set the stage perfectly. But I knew something she didn't. I knew that while I was taking my walk, I hadn't just been looking for Alvin. I had been making a phone call that changed the entire trajectory of this night. But before I could speak, I saw Megan move. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She just melted back into the shadows of the kitchen, taking advantage of the moment the officers were focused on me and Jordan. I saw her hand brush the counter where she'd left her wine glass. She wasn't going for the garage to check on Alvin. She was heading for the utility closet near the back door. I knew this house better than she did. I had designed the original renovations myself before gifting it to them. I knew that the main gas shutoff for the interior was located in that closet, right next to the water heater. If she opened that valve and extinguished the pilot light, the house would fill with gas in minutes. All she needed was a spark. One frantic officer's flashlight clicking on, one neighbor's cigarette, or a deliberate flick of a lighter, and the problem of Malachi Hayes and the evidence of their debt would be vaporized in a tragic accident caused by a confused old man. "She's going to the back," I shouted, surging to my feet. "Stay seated, sir," the officer barked, his hand moving to his belt. "The gas," I yelled, pointing toward the kitchen. "She's going for the gas line. Check the garage." "Alvin is in the garage." The officer hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the kitchen. Jordan froze, his eyes widening as he looked toward where his wife had disappeared. For a split second, I saw the realization in my son's eyes that Megan was capable of something even he hadn't imagined. "Megan?" Jordan whispered, his voice cracking. "Megan, what are you doing?" Suddenly, a loud, metallic clack echoed from the back of the house. It was the sound of a heavy wrench hitting a pipe. Then, the unmistakable, sickening hiss of escaping gas. "Back out, everyone out," the lead officer shouted, grabbing his radio. "We have a possible gas leak. Suspect in the rear of the structure. Breach the garage now." The house erupted into a new kind of madness. The officers who had been questioning me were now pushing me toward the front door. Jordan was shouting for Megan, his voice high and thin with a terror that was finally real. But Megan didn't come out. I didn't run for the street. As we hit the front lawn, I twisted out of the officer's grip. I didn't look at the police or the growing crowd of neighbors. I looked at the garage door. It was a heavy, motorized door, but there was a manual release. I ran. My 72-year-old legs felt like they were made of lead, every joint screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I reached the side door of the garage just as the hiss from the house grew louder, a predatory sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "Mr. Hayes, get back!" an officer yelled, but I was already at the door. It was locked, but I didn't need a key. I grabbed a heavy decorative stone from the edge of the yellowed lawn, the same one where I'd found the spare key years ago, and smashed the small glass pane. I reached inside and turned the handle. The garage was dark, smelling of oil, old tires, and something else, something human. "Alvin!" I shouted, my voice raw. I heard a muffled grunt from the corner, behind a stack of empty moving boxes. I scrambled over, my hands shaking. There he was. Alvin Henderson was zip-tied to a heavy work stool, a thick piece of duct tape across his mouth. His eyes were wide, bloodshot with rage and fear, but he was alive. "I've got you, Alvin. I've got you," I whispered, fumbling with the pocket knife I'd managed to keep hidden in my slacks. I sliced through the ties, my breathing coming in ragged gasps. The hiss of the gas from the main house was getting louder. It was a terrifying, invisible tide. They have a guy." Alvin coughed as soon as the tape was off, his voice a broken rasp. "A guy in the house. Not Vinny. Someone else. He's the one who did the line." I froze. If Megan wasn't the one who had turned the gas, then she was just as much a pawn as I was. "Where's Megan?" I asked, helping him to his feet. "She's in the kitchen," Alvin said, leaning heavily on me. "She went in there to talk to him. They're arguing about the papers. Mac, we have to get out. The whole place is a bomb." We stumbled out of the side door of the garage just as a black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb, blocking the police cruisers. 3 men stepped out. They weren't wearing uniforms. They were wearing well-tailored suits that didn't hide the bulk of the shoulder holsters beneath. At the center was a man I recognized from the hospital room, the one Alvin had described. Vinny. He wasn't the muscle I'd seen the night before. He was the architect of the misery. He looked at the house, then at the police, then at me. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed, like a man whose lunch had been interrupted. "Mr. Hayes," Vinny said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm over the sound of the sirens and the gas. "It seems your son has made a very mess of things. And my associate in the house is a bit of a pyromaniac when he gets frustrated. Tell him to stop," I said, my heart hammering. "The police are here. It's over." Vinny smiled, a thin, cold line. "The police are here because I called them Malachi. A missing person report? That was me. I needed a distraction so we could get the signature without any interference from your neighbor. But Megan, she tried to negotiate. She tried to tell me the house was worth more than the debt. She tried to play me." He checked his watch, a gold Patek Philippe that shimmered in the strobe lights. "In about 3 minutes, the fire department will arrive. They'll find a tragic accident, a grieving widower, a stressed-out couple, and a faulty water heater. And the best part? I already have the signed power of attorney. Megan brought it out to the car 5 minutes ago." My blood turned to ice. "She signed it?" "Oh, she didn't just sign it. She forged your name beautifully," Vinny said. "She's quite the artist. It doesn't matter if it's real or not, Malachi. By the time the courts figure it out, the property will be sold to a shell company in the Caymans, and the money will be long gone, along with everyone who could testify otherwise." He looked at the house. The hiss had stopped. That was worse. That meant the house was full. The concentration was perfect. "Jordan!" I screamed, looking toward the front door. My son was standing on the lawn, staring at the house like a man in a trance. He saw me. He saw Vinny. and then he saw the kitchen window. Megan was there. She was pressed against the glass, her face a mask of absolute, screaming terror. Behind her, a dark shadow moved the man from the night before, the one with the canvas jacket. He wasn't holding a wrench anymore, he was holding a flare. "Dad!" Jordan wailed, finally snapping out of his paralysis. He started to run toward the porch. Megan's still inside. He's going to kill her. "Jordan, no." I lunged for him, but I was too slow. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Jordan reached the porch. The man in the kitchen struck the flare. The explosion didn't sound like a bang. It sounded like the world was being torn in half. A wall of orange flame erupted from the kitchen windows, shattering the glass into a million diamond-like shards that caught the light of the police sirens. The force of the blast threw Jordan backward off the porch, his body a rag doll in the air. The shockwave knocked me to my knees. The heat seared my face, and the roar of the fire filled my ears until it was the only thing in the universe. I watched as the house I'd bought for my son, the foundation I had so carefully built, turned into a towering inferno. Vinny didn't flinch. He just adjusted his tie and turned back toward his SUV. "A shame," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. "I really did like that terracotta roof." He climbed into the car and pulled away, the black windows reflecting the fire. The police were scrambled, the neighbors were screaming, and the fire trucks were finally turning the corner. I crawled toward Jordan. He was lying on the grass, his clothes singed, his face covered in soot and blood. He was breathing, but his eyes were wide and vacant, staring at the burning wreckage of his life. "Megan," he whispered, a single tear cutting a clean line through the ash on his cheek. She was gone. The woman who had tried to liquidate me had been liquidated herself. And as I held my broken son in the shadow of the fire, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. Because as the firemen began to pour water onto the ruins, an officer walked over to me, holding something he'd found on the edge of the lawn. It was Megan's designer bag. It was charred, but the contents were intact. He pulled out the power of attorney papers. They were signed, they were notarized, and they didn't just transfer the house. I didn't know it yet, but Megan had made one final move before the flare was lit. She hadn't just forged my name to pay Vinny. She had taken out a $5 million life insurance policy on me, naming herself and a business trust controlled by Vinny as the sole beneficiaries. And the policy had a very specific clause about accidental death in the home. The explosion hadn't been meant to kill her. It had been meant to kill me. And now, according to those papers, I was legally dead, and Vinny was coming to collect. The heat of the blast was still radiating from the asphalt, a shimmering, invisible wall that smelled of pulverized drywall and burnt insulation. I sat on the curb, the blue and red strobe lights of the emergency vehicles pulsing against the thick, black smoke that choked the California sky. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched, lonely whine that seemed to drown out the sirens and the frantic shouting of the fire crews. I looked at my hands. They were covered in a fine layer of gray ash, the remains of the life I had tried to build for my son. A few feet away, Jordan was being loaded onto a gurney. He was awake, but his eyes were fixed on the sky, wide and unblinking. He looked like a man who had stared into the sun and finally understood its power to blind. They had given him a sedative, but it couldn't touch the horror etched into the lines of his face. He hadn't spoken since the explosion. He hadn't asked about Megan. Deep down, in the part of his soul he usually kept buried under layers of excuses, he knew. He knew she was gone, and he knew why. "Mr. Hayes, can you hear me?" I looked up. It was Officer Diaz. His uniform was soot-stained, and his face was grim. He held a charred, leather-bound folder, the one that had been in Megan's bag. He sat down on the curb next to me, his heavy tactical belt creaking. "My neighbor," I rasped, my voice feeling like I'd swallowed glass. "Alvin, is he?" "Henderson is tough," Diaz said, offering a small, tight nod. "He's got some smoke inhalation and a few bruises from the zip ties, but he's talking. He's already giving a statement to the detectives. He's the only reason we're not treating you as a suspect right now, Malachi." I leaned my head back, closing my eyes. I could still see the flare. I could still see the man in the canvas jacket, that shadow in the kitchen who had turned a home into a furnace. "There was a man inside," I whispered. "He worked for Vinny." "We're looking for him," Diaz replied, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. In an explosion like that, evidence doesn't just burn, it evaporates. "But we found something else. This folder, the power of attorney papers, and a life insurance policy. He opened the charred folder. The edges of the paper were brittle, but the text was clear. I stared at the numbers. $5 million. It was a staggering amount, the kind of money that makes people forget they have a conscience. My name was at the top. Megan's was at the bottom, alongside a name I'd never heard. The Aegis Group. I didn't sign that, I said, my voice gaining a sudden cold strength. I've never even seen that policy. We know, Diaz said, his eyes scanning the street. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost to the roar of the fire hoses. But Vinny's people are already moving. A lawyer for the Aegis Group called the precinct 10 minutes ago. They aren't reporting an accident, Malachi. They're reporting a death. Your death. The world seemed to tilt. I'm sitting right here. On paper, you're not, Diaz said. They're claiming the remains found in the kitchen, which we suspect are the hitman's, belong to you. They have a witness ready to testify that you were the one who went back inside to save Megan. It's a perfect narrative. The grieving hero, the tragic accident. By the time the DNA comes back in 3 weeks, that $5 million will be laundered through 6 different countries. I felt a coldness settle into my marrow. It wasn't fear. It was the absolute, crystalline realization that I was no longer playing a game of leverage. I was a dead man walking. If Vinny's plan was to collect on my death, he couldn't afford for me to be alive to contest the claim. If I stay here, I said, looking at the ambulance carrying my son away, I'm a target. You're more than a target, Diaz whispered. You're a loose end. And Vinny doesn't leave those. He looked around, then pressed a small, crumpled piece of paper into my hand. Go, now, before the high-ups from the DA's office get here. Henderson told me to give you this. It's a contact. Someone Serena knew. I didn't ask questions. I stood up, my joints screaming, and walked away from the light of the fire. I didn't take a car. I didn't go to the hospital. I walked 3 blocks until I found a flickering payphone outside a 2-4-hour laundromat, a relic of a bygone era, much like myself. I dialed the number on the paper. The foundation is laid, a woman's voice said on the second ring. It wasn't Cynthia Pham. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. A woman named Elena who had once worked for Serena's private security firm before my wife retired to a life of tea and roses. It's Malachi, I said. The building has collapsed. I know, she said, her voice like silk over steel. Serena told me to expect your call. Not today, not even this year, but she knew. She had a file on Vinny Gargano, since before Jordan even met Megan. She knew the debt was coming. I leaned my forehead against the cold metal of the phone booth. Serena, even from the grave, she was the architect. She had seen the rot in Megan. She had seen the weakness in Jordan, and she had built a secondary defense I never even knew existed. What do I do? I asked. You disappear, Elena said. For the next 48 hours, Malachi Hayes is dead. Let them file the claim. Let them show their hand. I have a car waiting for you at the corner of Slauson and La Brea, black sedan. Don't look at the driver. I hung up the phone. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. I had lost my home. I had lost my son's respect. I had nearly lost my life. I was at the very bottom, stripped of everything but the clothes on my back and the watch on my wrist. But as I walked toward the meeting point, the grief began to burn off, leaving behind a hard, obsidian core of resolve. Vinny thought he was the one who had liquidated me. He thought he was the one who had turned my life into a payout. He had no idea that he was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. You never, ever try to outdesign an architect. The car was there, idling in the shadows. I slipped into the back seat. The driver didn't speak. We drove for an hour, weaving through the labyrinthine streets of Los Angeles, until we reached a nondescript warehouse in the industrial district of San Pedro. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of salt and old paper. Elena was waiting for me. She looked older, her hair a sharp silver bob, but her eyes were just as lethal as I remembered. She led me to a small office filled with monitors and stacks of documents. Look at this, she said, gesturing to a screen. It was a live feed of a high-end office in Beverly Hills. I saw Vinny. He was sitting at a glass desk, laughing, a glass of scotch in his hand. Across from him was a man in a sharp suit, a lawyer. They just filed the preliminary paperwork, Elena said. They're fast-tracking the payout. But here's the part they didn't count on. She pulled up a document on the second monitor. Serena didn't just have a trust for the house. She had a dead man switch on your life insurance. If any claim was made on your life while Jordan was in debt to a third party, The entire payout is automatically diverted to a secondary trust, one that Megan and Vinny can't touch. Where does the money go? I asked. To an account that funds an investigation into the very person who filed the claim, Elena said, a dark smile touching her lips. Serena built a trap that uses their own greed as the bait. They think they're about to get $5 million. Instead, they're about to trigger a federal audit that will uncover every shell company Vinny has ever used. I sat down, the weight of Serena's brilliance pressing on me. She had loved me enough to let me be the blind father, but she had loved me more by ensuring I'd be protected when I finally had to see. But they'll kill Jordan, I said, the thought suddenly cold and sharp. If the money doesn't come through, Vinny will realize Jordan is useless to him. Not if we move first, Elena said. We have 48 hours before the bank notifies them of the diverted funds. In that time, we need to get to the man in the canvas jacket. The one who survived the explosion. My heart skipped. He survived? He came out the back door just before the blast, Elena said, pulling up a grainy thermal image from a neighbor's security camera. He's wounded, but he's alive. He's hiding out at a clinic Vinny uses in East LA. If we get him to talk, we don't just stop the insurance fraud. We put Vinny away for murder. I looked at my hands. They were steady now. The fragile old man was gone. I stood up, the aches in my body feeling like fuel. How do we get him? I asked. We don't, Elena said, looking me in the eye. You do. Vinny's people are looking for a dead man. They aren't looking for Malachi Hayes. You're going to walk right into that clinic, and you're going to show them exactly what happens when you try to burn an architect's house down. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a fire that had nothing to do with the gas explosion. I was going to hunt the man who had tried to kill me. I was going to save my son from the monster he'd invited into our lives. But as we prepared to leave, Elena's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, her face going pale. What is it? I asked. The clinic, she whispered. Vinny just sent a cleanup crew. They aren't going there to treat the hitman, Malachi. They're going there to finish him. And they just picked up someone else on the way. Who? Jordan, she said, her voice trembling. He just checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice. He's going to the clinic. He thinks Megan is there. I didn't wait for her to finish. I was already out the door. My son was walking into a slaughterhouse, still chasing the ghost of the woman who had tried to kill us both. I didn't know if I could get there in time. I didn't know if I could survive another night in the dark. But as I gripped the steering wheel of the car Elena had given me, I realized I hadn't even told Cynthia about the second safe, the one Serena had hidden in the floor of the Atlanta house. The one that contained the real reason Vinny was so desperate to kill me. The house wasn't the collateral. I was. And what was inside that safe was the only thing that could stop the fire from spreading. The drive through the industrial arteries of East Los Angeles felt like traveling through the gut of a beast that had already swallowed me whole. The city lights were a dirty neon blur against the smog, and the air coming through the vents of the sedan tasted of salt and premonition. I was a dead man, legally erased by a charred folder and a forged signature, and there is a strange, liberating power in having nothing left to lose. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her laptop casting a ghostly blue glow over her face. She was tapping into the city's traffic cams with a speed that spoke of a life lived in the shadows. They're 5 minutes ahead of us, Malachi, she said, her voice tight. Jordan's car is parked 2 blocks from the clinic. He's walking. He's a sitting duck. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the dark leather. I thought about the first time I held Jordan in the hospital in Atlanta. He was so small, so fragile, and I had promised him and Serena that I would build a world where he would never have to be afraid. I had succeeded in building the world, but in doing so, I had failed to build the man. He's looking for a ghost, I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. He thinks Megan is some kind of miracle survivor. He doesn't realize Vinny uses hope as a lure. Vinny doesn't just want the insurance money anymore, Elena muttered, her eyes fixed on the screen. He knows the dead man's switch has been tripped. He knows the feds are going to be knocking on his door by Monday morning. He's in scorched earth mode. He wants to wipe the Hayes name off the map before he disappears. We pulled onto a side street lined with shuttered warehouses and flickering street lamps. The clinic was a squat, 2-story brick building with barred windows and a sign that claimed it was an urgent care center, though the lack of cars in the lot suggested it dealt in a different kind of urgency. I saw Jordan's car, a silver Lexus I'd bought him for his 35th birthday, abandoned haphazardly near a fire hydrant. My heart lurched. He was inside. Stay here, I told Elena. Like hell I will, she snapped. reaching into the glove box and pulling out a compact black pistol. "I promised Serena I'd keep you alive. That's a lot harder to do if you're playing hero in a den of vipers." "They think I'm dead, Elena," I said, turning to her. I let her see the look in my eyes, the cold, architectural precision that had replaced my grief. "A dead man is the only thing Vinny's crew isn't prepared for. Let me be the ghost, you be the backup." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. 30 seconds behind you. If I hear a shot, I'm coming in hot." I stepped out of the car. The night air was cool, but I felt a feverish heat in my blood. I walked toward the clinic's back entrance, my footsteps silent. I didn't use the front door. I knew how these places were built. I found the service entrance near the dumpsters. The lock had been forced fresh scratches on the metal. I slipped inside. The hallway smelled of bleach and old blood. A single flickering light at the far end cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling linoleum. I moved with a grace I hadn't felt in years. Every joint in my 72-year-old body suddenly fluid and sharp. I wasn't an ATM. I wasn't a fragile old man. I was the architect, and I was looking at a floor plan that needed to be redrawn. I heard voices from a room halfway down the hall. "Where is she? You said she was here." Jordan's voice was high, hysterical. It was the sound of a man who had lost his mind along with his house. "Relax, kid. She's being stabilized." A voice replied, the same stone-grinding voice I'd heard in the hallway of the house. The man in the canvas jacket. He sounded weak, breathless. "But Vinny's got a question for you first. About the safe. The one in Atlanta." I froze, my back against the cold brick wall. The safe. The one Serena had hidden under the floorboards of our study. I hadn't even told Jordan about it. How did Vinny know? "I don't know anything about a safe," Jordan wailed. "Just let me see her, please." The old man had a second set of books. "Jordan," the hitman rasped. I could hear a wet, rattling cough. "The real records of the Hayes firm. The offshore accounts Serena managed. Vinny knows they're in that safe. He wants the code. You give us the code, maybe you and the wife get to ride off into the sunset." I peeked around the corner. The room was a small exam bay. Jordan was standing in the center, his face a ruin of soot and tears. Sitting on an exam table, his chest wrapped in blood-stained bandages, was the man from the kitchen. He looked like he'd been dragged through hell, but he was still holding a suppressed pistol leveled at Jordan's chest. And in the corner, standing in the shadows, were two more men. Vinny's cleanup crew. They were dressed in black, their faces indifferent, waiting for the command to finish the job. "I don't have the code!" Jordan screamed, dropping to his knees. "I don't know anything. Please, just kill me if you're gonna do it, but tell me if she's alive." The hitman laughed, a sickening, gurgling sound. "She's as dead as your old man, kid. The flare took care of that. Vinny just needed you here to see if you had any value left. Turns out, you're just an empty pocket." He signaled to the two men in the corner. They stepped forward, one of them pulling a garrote wire taut between his hands. "Wait," I said. The word wasn't a shout. It was a command, delivered with the absolute authority of a man who owned the air in the room. The two men froze. The hitman's eyes widened, his jaw dropping as he stared toward the doorway. Jordan slowly turned his head, his eyes bulging as he looked at me. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice a tiny broken thing. I stepped into the light. I was covered in soot, my clothes torn, my arm bruised and bare where the sling had been. I looked like a specter risen from the ash of the house. I looked like the personification of their guilt. "The code is the 12th of August, 2074, I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "The date of my wedding. The day I started building a life you weren't worthy of, Jordan." The hitman tried to raise his gun, but he was too slow, too weak. I didn't have a weapon, but I didn't need one. Elena appeared in the doorway behind me, her pistol leveled at the men in the corner. "Drop it," she said, her voice a whip crack. "Now." The man with the garrote dropped the wire as if it were white hot. The other man raised his hands, but the hitman on the table, the one who had held the flare, he just stared at me with a twisted, admiring grin. You're the one," he coughed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Vinny said. He said you were a ghost. He didn't say you were the devil." "I'm just a father," I said, walking toward him. I didn't look at the other men. I didn't look at Jordan, who was still sobbing on the floor. I looked at the man who had tried to vaporize my life. "And you're a man who's about to die in a dirty clinic for a boss who sent these two to kill you?" I gestured to the cleanup crew. The hitman's eyes flicked to his associates, and I saw the realization hit him. Vinny hadn't sent them to rescue him. He had sent them to close the file. He's at the office, the hitman whispered, his strength failing. The Beverly Hills office. He's leaving at midnight. He's taking the Aegis files. And the recording. What recording? I asked, leaning in close. The one from the kitchen, he gasped. Megan. She didn't know the house had a second system. Not yours. Hers. She was recording you, Mac. To prove you were senile. But she caught it all. The debt. Vinny's threats. The hit. Vinny has the drive. He's going to destroy it. My heart hammered. A recording. The final, definitive nail, in Vinny Gargano's coffin. Suddenly, a siren wailed in the distance, not the police, but another ambulance. The two men in the corner saw their chance. One of them lunged for Elena, while the other dove for the back window. Pop. Pop. Elena fired twice. The man lunging for her crumpled to the floor. Clutching his leg, the other smashed through the glass, disappearing into the night. I didn't care about them. I turned to Jordan. He was looking at me, his face a mask of such profound shame, it was almost hard to look at. Dad, I thought you were dead. I thought I'd killed you. I looked at him, my son, the man who had bartered my life for a Rolex and a lie. I wanted to scream. I wanted to strike him. But instead, I felt a cold, surgical detachment. You did kill me, Jordan, I said. The father you knew is buried in the ashes of that house. Now, there's only the man who's going to finish this. I turned to Elena. We have to get to Beverly Hills. Now, if he destroys that drive, the insurance fraud is the least of our problems. He'll walk away from the murder charge. What about him? Elena asked, gesturing to the hitman, who was now slumped over, his breathing a wet, shallow rattle. Call it in, I said. Let the police find him. He's a witness now, whether he likes it or not. I started for the door, but Jordan grabbed my sleeve. Dad, please, let me help. I want to make it right. I'll do anything. I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. I didn't see the boy I'd raised. I saw a man who had finally realized that the world doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you've built. You want to help, Jordan? I asked. Then you're going to be the one to hand the files to the DA. You're going to tell them everything, every lie, every debt, every moment you watched your wife try to kill your father. He flinched, but he didn't let go. Okay, he whispered. Okay. We ran for the car. The midnight deadline was looming like a guillotine. But as we pulled away from the clinic, Elena's phone chirped again. Mac, she said, her voice trembling. The insurance company, they didn't just divert the funds, they just released a preliminary payment to a third party. Who? Not Vinny, she said, staring at the screen. A shell company registered in Georgia, to an address I recognize. My blood turned to ice. It was my own address in Atlanta. She's not dead, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The woman in the kitchen, the terror on the glass, the explosion. It had been a masterpiece of misdirection. Megan hadn't been the victim. She had been the one holding the flare, and she was already halfway to my home. The drive to Beverly Hills was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and heavy, suffocating silence. In the back seat, Jordan was a ghost of a man, his eyes fixed on his soot-stained hands as if they belonged to a stranger. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just existed in the hollowed-out space where his life used to be. Every few minutes he'd look at me, his eyes pleading for a fatherly comfort I no longer had the heart to give. The man who had walked onto that porch in Ladera Heights was gone, replaced by the architect, cold, precise, and focused on the demolition. Midnight, Elena whispered, her foot heavy on the accelerator. Vinny's private security firm is already clearing the building. If we don't get that drive, the last piece of evidence that ties him to the explosion disappears. And Megan, if she's already in Atlanta, she's after the primary trust documents in your floor safe. She's not going to get them, I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. She thinks she's playing a game of speed. She doesn't realize she's playing a game of architecture. You don't break into a house Serena Hayes secured. You just walk into a cage. We arrived at the gleaming glass tower in Beverly Hills at 11:45 p.m. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and indifference. Vinny's business was a front for high-stakes debt restructuring, a polite name for human misery. We didn't take the elevators. Elena knew the service codes. We moved through the back, bypassing the security desk that Vinny's payroll already owned. We reached the 34th floor. The doors hissed open to a suite that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and the metallic tang of high-end electronics. Vinny was there, standing at a window that overlooked the sprawling, glittering lights of the city he thought he conquered. He was holding a small silver thumb drive, turning it over in his hand with a contemplative smile. "You're late, Malachi," Vinny said without turning around. "But I suppose dying and coming back to life takes a bit out of a man." "Drop the drive, Vinny," I said. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Elena's pistol and the hollowed-out wreck of my son. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored. "Or what? You'll shoot me? In a building full of my people? You're an architect, Malachi. You know about load-bearing walls. You pull one out, the whole thing comes down. I'm the wall. You kill me, and your son goes to prison for the rest of his life for the insurance fraud Megan set up. I'm the only one who can make that paperwork disappear. I'm not here to kill you," I said, stepping into the center of the room. "I'm here to finish the project." I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed a single button. On the massive monitors behind Vinny's desk, a video began to play. It wasn't the recording Megan had made. It was a live feed of Vinny's own server room, 3 floors below us. 2 men in tactical gear, Elena's team, were busy plugging a bypass device into the main frame. "The dead man's switch wasn't just about the insurance money, Vinny," I said. "Serena knew that if anyone ever tried to liquidate me, they'd go for your servers first to hide the debt. The moment that flare was lit in my kitchen, your entire digital history began uploading to a secure server at the Department of Justice. The insurance claim you just filed? It didn't go to your shell company. It went to a flagged account monitored by the FBI's racketeering division." Vinny's face finally changed. The mask of the polished businessman crumbled, revealing the panicked predator beneath. He looked at the drive in his hand, the evidence he thought he was destroying, and realized it was a paperweight. You old bastard," he hissed. "The architect doesn't just build," I said. "He anticipates. You thought you were the predator because you had the guns and the grit. But Serena was the one who designed the labyrinth. You've been walking the paths she laid out for years." Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the office burst open. Not the police. It was Vinny's own head of security, his face pale. "Boss, the feds are in the lobby. They have a warrant for everything. We have to go." Vinny looked at me, a flash of pure, murderous intent in his eyes. He reached for a drawer in his desk, but Elena fired a single shot into the mahogany, inches from his hand. "Don't," she said. Vinny froze. He looked at the window, then at the door, and finally at me. He saw the truth. He was out of time, out of moves, and out of lies. As the distant wail of sirens grew louder, echoing off the glass towers of Beverly Hills, Vinny Gargano simply sat down in his leather chair and closed his eyes. He was a man who understood the math. He was done. "Take him," I told Elena. "I have a flight to catch." The private jet ride to Atlanta was the longest 4 hours of my life. Jordan sat across from me, his head in his hands. He hadn't spoken since the office. He knew that the only reason he wasn't in handcuffs alongside Vinny was because I was his father, but he also knew that father was a title I was currently holding in probate. "She's at the house, isn't she?" Jordan finally asked, his voice a ghost of a whisper as we crossed into Georgia airspace. "She is," I said. "She used the hitman's body as a decoy. She knew the dental records would take weeks to sort out. She thought she'd have the insurance payout and my floor safe before anyone realized she wasn't the one who died in that kitchen." "Why, Dad? Why would she go this far?" I looked out the window at the dark expanse of the South beneath us. "Because she didn't just want the house, Jordan. She wanted the empire. She wanted the $30 million Serena and I built. And she realized that as long as I was alive or as long as the truth was hidden, she'd always just be a tenant. She wanted to be the architect, but she forgot that she was building on sand." We landed at a private airstrip at 4 a.m. A car was waiting. We drove in silence through the familiar winding roads of my neighborhood, the towering oaks casting long, gnarled shadows over the pavement. As we pulled into my driveway, the 7,000-square-foot house I had designed for Serena stood like a silent sentinel in the moonlight. The front door was unlocked. I walked in first, my footsteps silent on the reclaimed heart pine floors. I didn't turn on the lights. I knew every inch of this place. I heard the sound of metal scraping against stone coming from the study. I pushed the heavy oak door open. There she was, Megan. She was wearing a dark jumpsuit, her hair pulled back, her face smudged with dirt. She was on her knees in the center of the room, a crowbar in her hand, struggling with the heavy brass plate that covered the floor safe. She looked up, the moonlight catching the sheer predatory desperation in her eyes. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stared at me, then at Jordan, who stood in the doorway behind me. "You're supposed to be Ash," she hissed, her voice a jagged rasp. "I've always had a sturdy foundation, Megan," I said. She surged to her feet, the crowbar held like a weapon. "The money is mine. I earned it. 10 years of playing the doting wife to that pathetic loser. 10 years of listening to your simple man stories while you sat on millions. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," I said, walking toward her. I didn't stop until the tip of the crowbar was inches from my chest. I looked her in the eye, and for the first time I felt a strange sense of peace. "Serena knew you'd come here. She knew you couldn't resist the final prize." "The safe is empty, Megan," Jordan said, his voice cracking as he stepped into the room. He looked at his wife, the woman he'd burned his life for, and I saw the last of his delusions wither away. "There's no money in there." "There never was." Megan laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "You're lying. The offshore accounts, the buyout, it's all here." She slammed the crowbar into the brass plate, finally prying it up. She reached into the dark cavity of the safe, her fingers scrambling for the treasure she thought would save her. She pulled out a single, small, velvet box. With trembling hands, she flipped it open. There was no gold. There were no bearer bonds. Inside was a single dried rose from our garden and a small handwritten note in Serena's elegant script. Megan read the note, her face going from greedy anticipation to a waxy, horrified white. She dropped the box, the rose shattering into dust on the floorboards. "What does it say?" Jordan whispered. I picked up the note. I already knew the words. Serena had shown it to me years ago, a just-in-case that I never wanted to believe we'd need. "To the one who seeks what wasn't earned, true wealth is the peace you just destroyed. The police are 5 minutes away. I hope the fire was worth the cold." As if on cue, the long, low wail of sirens began to echo up the driveway. Blue and red lights began to dance against the study walls, reflecting off the portraits of a family that no longer existed. Megan slumped to the floor, the crowbar clattering beside her. She didn't fight. She didn't even look at Jordan. She just stared at the dust of the rose, the reality of her total, absolute failure finally sinking in. The aftermath was a quiet, clinical affair. Megan was charged with multiple counts of attempted murder, arson, and felony fraud. With the evidence from Vinny's servers and the dead man's switch data, she was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Vinny Gargano's empire was dismantled, his assets seized and used to fund the very foundation Serena had envisioned. Jordan didn't go to prison. I used every ounce of my influence and every dollar of my legal team to ensure he received a suspended sentence and mandatory psychiatric care. But he didn't stay in Atlanta. He couldn't. He moved to a small town in the Midwest, working a manual labor job under a different name. He writes to me once a month. I haven't answered yet. I'm waiting for him to build something on his own before I invite him back to the foundation. I sit on my porch now, the Atlanta sun warm on my face. The Serena Hayes Trust is the largest advocate for elder protection in the country. Alvin Henderson runs the LA branch. We talk every Sunday. I'm 74 now. I still drive my 10-year-old car. I still live simply. People in town see me and see a quiet, retired architect, a widower who tends to his roses and reads on his porch. They see a simple man, and that's the greatest design of all, because the world will always try to liquidate what it doesn't understand. It will always try to find the weakness in the walls. But as long as the foundation is built on the truth, the house will always stand. Serena was right. Silence isn't just golden, it's a blueprint. And I finally finished the build. I look at the Rolex on my wrist. It's still ticking, a steady, forever yours, S. I see you, Serena, I whisper into the breeze. The building is finished. I close my eyes and, for the first time in a long time, I am not the architect. I am just Malachi, and that is more than enough. The story of my life taught me that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who has already accounted for your greed. Jordan and Megan thought they were the ones playing for keeps, but they were just tenants in a house built of their own lies. If you ever find yourself being underestimated, don't correct them. Just keep building your foundation in the dark. What would you have done if you found that safe? Would you have been able to forgive a son who watched your world burn? Tell me in the comments. I'm still learning about the strength of the heart, even at 74. And if you believe that justice, like a good building, takes time to settle, hit the like button and subscribe. We have more stories to tell, stories of the quiet ones, the ones who watch, and the ones who finally stand up. Thanks for staying with me until the final brick was laid. I'll see you in the next one.